It was a quiet Thursday evening, one of those crisp, late autumn nights when the world feels suspended between the fiery colors of fall and the cold promise of winter. I had just finished an endless shift at the clinic, one of those grueling days where every second feels heavier than the last. My body ached in ways I didn't even know were possible, but it was the mental exhaustion that weighed me down the most. Dealing with worried patients, endless paperwork, and the occasional coworker drama had drained every ounce of energy I had. Still, I drove home with a flicker of hope, the thought of a peaceful evening pulling me forward. Home, to me, wasn't just a place, it was a reprieve. I imagined the warmth of the living room, the faint hum of the heater kicking on, and the soft, familiar sound of Luna's paws patting across the hardwood floor. My mischievous Tabby always had a way of making everything better, whether it was her dramatic meows demanding attention, or the way she curled up on my chest as if she were claiming me as her own. Alex, my partner, wouldn't be home tonight. He had taken on an extra catering gig for a private event. The holiday season always kept him busy. He thrived in the chaos of planning menus and serving high-end clients. I didn't mind. It meant I'd have the house mostly to myself. Well, myself and Ethan. Ethan was Alex's younger brother, and he'd been staying with us for a few months while trying to sort his life out. At 22, Ethan was at that odd crossroads in life where everything felt both full of possibility and utterly directionless. He was quieter than Alex, more reserved, but there was something about him that felt unsettled, like a storm quietly brewing just below the surface. When I pulled into the driveway, the sight of Ethan's car caught me off guard. It was parked at an odd angle, as if he'd rushed home and barely cared about straightening it out. That was unusual. Ethan usually spent his evenings out, where I didn't ask. I figured he needed the space to figure things out, and I wasn't one to pry. The house felt different when I stepped inside. Dark, quiet, still. Normally, Luna would come barreling toward me, meowing her demands for food or attention. But tonight there was nothing. Just silence and the faintest sound of running water coming from upstairs. "Ethan," I called out softly, my voice echoing through the empty house. No answer. I set my bag down and hesitated for a moment before heading upstairs. The sound of the running water grew louder, and as I approached the bathroom, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. A sliver of light spilled into the dark hallway, cutting through the stillness like a blade. I froze. Inside, Ethan stood at the sink, shirtless, his back turned to the door. His movements were hurried, almost frantic. The light above the mirror cast soft shadows over his back, highlighting the tension in his shoulders and the faint scars etched across his skin. For a moment I couldn't move. Something about the scene felt too intimate, too vulnerable, like I was intruding on a moment I wasn't meant to see. My brain, however, betrayed me, flashing with a thought I had no business entertaining. I tried to shake it off, but it lingered, unwelcome and undeniable. Then it happened. The floorboard under my foot creaked. Ethan's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto mine through the narrow gap in the door. His expression was a mix of alarm and embarrassment, his cheeks flushing a deep red that matched the tips of his ears. Sorry," he stammered, his voice cracking slightly. In one swift motion, he lunged forward and grabbed the door, pulling it shut with a soft thud. From behind the barrier, I heard him mutter, "Didn't mean to. Yeah, sorry." I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. Heat rushed to my face, and I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't quite place: embarrassment, confusion, and something else I wasn't ready to name. My hand hovered over the door for a moment before I pulled it back, unsure of what to do or say. For a few seconds, I just stared at the closed door, my mind racing. What was that about? Why had he been scrubbing at himself like that? And why, of all things, did I feel so thrown by it? I shook my head, trying to dismiss the strange tension in the air, but it clung to me like the faint scent of soap wafting from the bathroom. I lingered outside the bathroom door for another moment, unsure whether to retreat downstairs or stay and address what had just happened. My mind buzzed with a mix of confusion and concern. Ethan wasn't just acting embarrassed. Something deeper was clearly bothering him. And yet it wasn't my place to push. Taking a deep breath, I knocked gently on the door, the sound almost tentative against the stillness of the hallway. "Ethan," I called softly. "Look, it's okay." I didn't mean to barge in. There was no immediate response, just the faint shuffle of movement from the other side. I waited, giving him a moment to collect himself, then added, "You don't have to explain anything. Whatever's going on, it's your business. I'm not here to judge you." A long pause followed. Finally, his voice came through, quieter than usual. "It's nothing. I'm fine. Sorry about that." I leaned my shoulder against the wall, trying to keep my tone as calm and understanding as possible. "Ethan, it's not a big deal. Everyone has awkward moments, it happens. You're entitled to your privacy, and you don't have to feel weird about it." Another pause, this one shorter. Then I heard a faint exhale, almost like a sigh of relief. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice just loud enough to reach me through the door. The tension in my chest eased slightly, and I allowed myself a small smile. "Good. Well, I'll let you finish up. I'm going to make tea if you want some later." I turned to head downstairs, figuring it was best to give him space. But before I could take more than a step, the door creaked open behind me. I stopped and glanced back, surprised to see Ethan standing there, his hair damp and messy, his shirt hastily thrown on. "Wait," he said quietly, his hand gripping the edge of the door. His eyes darted to mine, then quickly away, like he wasn't sure he had the courage to say whatever was on his mind. I tilted my head, waiting patiently. "What is it?" He hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Finally, he stepped forward, his expression a mix of gratitude and vulnerability. "I just wanted to say thanks for not making this weird. You're the only one who doesn't make me feel like I'm screwing everything up all the time." His words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. There was something raw in his tone, an honesty he didn't often show. I offered him a reassuring smile. "You're not screwing up, Ethan. Everyone goes through stuff, it's part of life. You're figuring things out, and that's okay." For a second, he just stood there, his gaze flickering between me and the floor. Then, before I could say anything else, he took a step closer and leaned in. His movement was slow, almost hesitant, as if he was testing the waters, and before I fully registered what was happening, his lips brushed softly against my cheek. It was barely more than a fleeting touch, but it lingered in the air between us, charged with something unspoken. He pulled back quickly, his face flushing with embarrassment. "Sorry," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. I wanted to say thanks. For real." I blinked, caught off guard by the gesture. My hand instinctively rose to touch the spot where his lips had grazed my skin, but I stopped myself halfway. Instead, I gave him a gentle smile, doing my best to keep things light. "It's okay, Ethan. Really. I'm glad I could help." He nodded, his expression softening slightly, then turned and disappeared down the hallway without another word. I stood there for a moment, my thoughts swirling, before finally heading downstairs. The warmth of the kitchen greeted me as I busied myself with the kettle, but my mind was far from settled. The gesture hadn't been romantic, it couldn't have been. It was gratitude, pure and simple. But even as I repeated that thought to myself, I couldn't shake the strange mix of emotions stirring in my chest. As the morning wore on, Ethan seemed to relax more and more. He even cracked a few jokes, one of which had me laughing so hard I almost spilled my coffee. It was a side of him I hadn't seen before, light, carefree, and unexpectedly charming. By the time Alex came home later that afternoon, the house felt different, lighter. Ethan greeted his brother with a casual wave, his demeanor as calm and collected as ever. But as I watched the two of them talk, I couldn't help but notice something subtle yet significant about Ethan. There was a quiet confidence in the way he carried himself now, a calmness that hadn't been there before. It was like he'd shed some invisible weight, and I couldn't help but wonder if our conversation the night before had played a role in that change. Later that evening, as I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes, I found myself smiling, my mind drifting back to Ethan's smile, his laugh, and the way he seemed lighter today. I told myself it was just relief, that I was glad he seemed to be finding his footing. But deep down, I couldn't help but feel that something had shifted, not just in him but in me as well. That evening, the house was quiet, almost still. Alex was away at another event, leaving Ethan and me alone. The absence of noise amplified the sense of space, making every movement and sound feel deliberate. I had just finished tidying up the kitchen when Ethan wandered in, his steps hesitant, like he was carrying an unseen weight. He hovered near the doorway for a moment, then finally settled into a seat at the table, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his sleeve. I could feel it before he even said a word. A storm of emotions, bottled up for far too long, teetering on the edge of spilling over. He sat there for a while, as if testing whether he could trust the silence between us, whether he could trust me. And then it began. Slowly at first, fragments of thoughts, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't yet figured out. He spoke about Alex, about how growing up in his brother's shadow had shaped him in ways he didn't fully understand until recently. Alex, always composed, always successful, had been the benchmark Ethan felt he could never reach. It wasn't that Alex had done anything overtly cruel. It was the unspoken comparison, the pressure to measure up to someone who seemed to have it all together. Ethan's voice faltered as he confessed how exhausting it had been to live under that shadow. He talked about how he had tried to emulate Alex, tried to chase his kind of success, but it had left him feeling hollow, like he was running a race that wasn't his to begin with. Every decision he made seemed to circle back to the same question. What would Alex do? As he continued, his words grew heavier, more raw. He admitted that staying with us had been both a refuge and a source of guilt. He felt like a burden, like someone who couldn't figure out their life and had no business taking up space in ours. The self-recrimination in his voice was almost unbearable, and I had to grip the edge of the table to keep myself from interrupting him. What struck me most wasn't just the weight of what he was saying, but the vulnerability in his tone. It was like he was peeling back layers he had kept hidden from everyone, revealing parts of himself that he didn't even fully understand. I listened intently, my chest tightening with every word. I hadn't realized how deeply this struggle had cut into him, how much he had been carrying alone. He spoke of resentment, toward Alex, toward himself, but also of longing. He wanted to find his own path, to feel like he mattered for who he was, not for how well he could mimic someone else. When he finally stopped, the silence that followed was thick, charged with everything he had just laid bare. His eyes, usually so guarded, were glossy with unshed tears as they met mine. I could see the vulnerability there, the fear of judgment, the hope for understanding. Without thinking, I moved closer, my hand reaching out to rest gently on his. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it felt significant, like an acknowledgement, a promise that I had heard him and wasn't going anywhere. The air between us shifted then, heavy with something unspoken but undeniable. His gaze flickered to my hand, then back to my face, and for a moment, we just stayed there, caught in the weight of everything unsaid. And then it happened. Slowly, hesitantly, Ethan leaned in, his movements careful, almost unsure. His lips brushed against mine, soft and tentative, as if he was asking a question he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let the moment settle, let the kiss deepen ever so slightly. It wasn't rushed or passionate. It was something quieter, more intimate, as if it carried the weight of everything he had just shared. When we finally pulled apart, the space between us felt different. There was no awkwardness, no rush to fill the silence. Instead, there was an understanding, a connection that hadn't been there before. Ethan's eyes searched mine, and I could see the gratitude in them, the quiet relief of having been heard, of being seen, not as Alex's brother, not as someone who didn't measure up, but as himself. I sat there with him for a while longer, the unspoken promise between us lingering in the air. Whatever came next, it was clear that something had shifted, not just for him, but for both of us. When Alex returned later in the evening, the atmosphere shifted again. Ethan became more reserved, his openness retreating behind the familiar mask he wore around his brother. Alex, as always, was full of stories from work, unaware of the tension simmering just beneath the surface. I watched the interaction between the two of them with new eyes. Alex's confidence, his easy way of commanding the room, only highlighted the discomfort Ethan seemed to feel in his presence. It was as if Ethan was constantly measuring himself against Alex, his every word and action weighed down by an invisible scale. That night, after Alex had gone to bed, Ethan and I found ourselves alone again. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He sat on the edge of the couch, his posture stiff, his eyes focused on some distant point in the room. I sat beside him, careful not to crowd his space. He didn't look at me, but I could feel the tension radiating off him. Slowly, I reached out, placing my hand gently on his. He didn't pull away this time. There was no need for words. The weight of the moment, the quiet understanding between us, said more than anything else could. Ethan had spent so long carrying the burden of his insecurities, of feeling like he wasn't enough. And while I couldn't fix that for him, I could be there. I could remind him, in small ways, that he was seen, that he mattered. It wasn't about Alex anymore. It wasn't about comparisons or expectations. It was about Ethan finding himself, about him learning to step out of the shadow he had lived in for so long. And perhaps it was about me too, learning to navigate the complexities of what this connection meant, what it could mean. The days after that night felt like a slow unraveling, each one a soft brushstroke on a canvas that was still too complex to fully understand. The house was quieter than usual, but not in a heavy, oppressive way. It was more like a silence pregnant with anticipation, with something unsaid, hovering just out of reach. Ethan and I slipped into a subtle, almost unspoken rhythm. There were moments when our eyes met across the room, a fleeting exchange that held more weight than any conversation could. It was like we were both testing the waters, unsure of what came next, but unwilling to let go of the connection that had unexpectedly blossomed between us. Alex, on the other hand, remained oblivious to the shift. He was always busy, late nights, early mornings, catering events that kept him on his feet. And I could tell that, as much as Ethan had tried to bury it, the absence of his brother left a space that was growing harder and harder to ignore. Ethan, who had spent so long being in the background, found himself caught between two worlds, the one where he tried to live up to the image of his older brother, and the one where he was trying to carve out a life for himself, one step at a time. The contrast between these worlds was becoming more apparent with each passing day. It was during one of those quiet evenings, the rain tapping gently on the windows as autumn settled in fully, that Ethan and I found ourselves once more on the couch. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, sending warm light dancing across the room, but the air between us was thick with unspoken things. We had been sitting in silence for a while, the soft scent of chamomile tea hanging in the air, when Ethan finally spoke. His voice was softer than usual, the words hesitant, as though he wasn't sure he should say them out loud. He began talking about Alex, his brother, the one who seemed to have it all figured out. Ethan's tone was bitter, but there was something else there, too, something raw. A quiet sorrow that he had been carrying for longer than I realized. He spoke of the years he had spent in Alex's shadow, the constant comparisons, the feeling of never measuring up. "He's always been the one everyone looks up to," Ethan murmured, his gaze fixed on the fire. "The one who had everything. Success, confidence, a plan. And then there's me, always falling behind, never quite reaching what he did. I don't even know how to begin to find my own path when all I've ever seen is his." I could see the hurt in his eyes, the frustration of feeling as though he were constantly fighting an uphill battle. He didn't say it outright, but I could hear it. The loneliness of being the second choice, the one left behind. His voice wavered as he admitted his doubts. "It's like I've spent my whole life trying to keep up with him, trying to be something I'm not, but I don't even know who I am anymore. It's like there's this image of me in everyone else's mind, and I can't get out from under it." The pain in his words hit me harder than I expected. I knew that Ethan had always seemed reserved, but hearing him say it out loud, the weight of it was like seeing the cracks in a wall that had always seemed solid. This wasn't just about his brother. It was about him, about the way he had viewed himself all this time. The way he felt small in the shadow of someone else's light. I didn't say anything at first, letting the silence hang between us, thick and heavy. The rain had picked up outside, drumming steadily against the windows, but all I could hear was the quiet hum of Ethan's words, echoing in my mind. This wasn't a simple conversation. This was something deeper, something raw and real. Then, as if to break the tension, he turned toward me, his eyes searching mine, almost pleading. I could see the vulnerability there, the way he was bearing himself in a way he had never done before. His walls, those silent barriers he had built around himself, were crumbling, and I could see the person beneath them, hurting, unsure, but desperate for someone to understand. Without thinking, I reached out and touched his hand, giving him a small, silent comfort. He flinched at first, as if unsure whether he should allow himself to feel what was happening between us. But then, slowly, he relaxed, his fingers curling around mine. The connection was electric, an unspoken promise that we were in this together, whatever it might be. And then, as if the weight of everything between us had reached its breaking point, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine in the gentlest of touches. It wasn't a kiss of passion or urgency. It was something softer, quieter, a release. A way to share everything that had been building between us without the need for words. When he pulled back, his eyes were wide, almost searching, as though he wasn't sure what he had just done or what it meant. But there was a flicker of something in his gaze, something softer, more vulnerable. And in that moment, I knew that this wasn't just about a kiss. It was about everything that had led up to it. The pain, the doubts, the need for connection. It was a moment of trust, of giving into something that neither of us could define, but both of us desperately needed. I didn't need to say anything. I didn't need to reassure him, because the kiss had already spoken more than words ever could. It was a silent understanding between us, one that didn't need explanation. For the first time in a long time, Ethan seemed to let go of the weight he had carried for so long. And as we sat there, the rain falling outside and the fire crackling in the hearth, it felt as though we had crossed some invisible threshold. We weren't just two people living in the same house anymore. We were something more, something that neither of us could quite put into words, but something that was there, undeniable. The weather had taken on that crisp, golden quality that autumn often brings, the kind that makes you want to spend the whole day outside. It was the perfect day for a picnic, and I suggested it to Ethan, eager to get some fresh air and escape the confines of the house. Ethan had seemed lighter lately, his mood shifting in small ways, so I thought the change of scenery would do us both some good. We packed a basket with sandwiches, some fruit, and thermoses of tea, and drove to a nearby park, nestled away in the quiet of the countryside. The golden leaves of the trees were scattered across the ground like nature's confetti, and the lake glimmered in the distance, reflecting the pale blue sky. As we walked along the trail, there was a new ease between us, no more tension, no more awkwardness. We were walking side by side, and although we didn't speak much, it felt comfortable, like we were simply enjoying each other's presence. Ethan occasionally pointed out something interesting, like a particularly large oak tree or a group of birds flying overhead, his voice light and animated. When we reached the perfect spot by the lake, the world around us seemed to slow down. We spread out the blanket and unpacked the food, sitting down together, the gentle hum of nature surrounding us. Ethan took a deep breath, and I could see a small smile tug at the corner of his mouth as he looked around. For a moment, I wasn't sure if he was smiling at the beauty of the day, or simply at the fact that he could be in this peaceful moment without feeling like he had to live up to anyone's expectations. We sat together in silence, eating, enjoying the tranquility, and letting the warmth of the sun bathe us in its glow. The conversation drifted from the mundane to the more personal, with Ethan sharing bits and pieces of his past, things he had never mentioned before. He spoke of his childhood, his family, and how he had always felt like he was struggling to find his place. It was the first time I'd heard him speak about his relationship with Alex so openly, without the walls of defensiveness or distance. He admitted that growing up in his brother's shadow had always been hard, especially since Alex had always seemed to have everything figured out, his career, his life, his future. Ethan, on the other hand, had always felt like he was just trying to catch up. The more he spoke, the more it became clear that his struggles weren't just about feeling less than Alex. They were about his own fear of not living up to the person he wanted to be. I listened, nodding, understanding more than he realized. I could feel the weight of his words, and as he spoke I reached out, placing my hand gently over his. It wasn't something I had planned. It was just an instinct, a gesture of comfort. His eyes flicked to mine, a soft, vulnerable expression crossing his face, and I could see that he appreciated the gesture, even if he didn't fully know how to respond to it. There was a moment of stillness between us, the air thick with unspoken thoughts and emotions. Ethan's gaze dropped to my hand, still resting over his, and then slowly, almost tentatively, his fingers intertwined with mine. It wasn't much, but it felt like everything. As the afternoon wore on, the light began to fade, casting long shadows across the grass. We packed up the picnic and started walking back toward the car, but this time there was something different between us. We were no longer just two people on a casual outing. We were two people who had shared something important, something intimate, a moment of true connection that couldn't be taken back. When we reached the edge of the park, I stopped, turning to face him. There was something in the air, an electric charge that neither of us could ignore. Ethan was standing close, his eyes searching mine, his hand still holding mine, as though he wasn't ready to let go. And maybe neither of us were. Without saying a word, I reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, it felt like everything. Ethan's lips parted slightly, and before I could think, before I could second-guess myself, he leaned down, his face coming closer to mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, an exploration of the space that had opened between us. His lips pressed gently against mine, and for a moment, everything else faded. There was no past, no future, just the quiet certainty of the present, the warmth of the connection we shared. When we pulled away, I could feel my heart racing in my chest, and I saw that Ethan's was too. We stood there for a moment, both of us taking in what had just happened. There were no words, no need for any. The kiss had spoken for itself. As we walked back to the car, our hands were still intertwined, but there was no rush now. We both knew that this was a beginning, not the end. Whatever came next, we would face it together. As we drove back home, the world seemed a little quieter, a little softer. The weight of the day had melted away, and the space between us felt charged in the best possible way. Neither of us said much, there was no need. The air was full of a quiet, shared understanding that had grown between us. When we got back, we lingered by the car, not wanting to break the moment just yet. Ethan's eyes met mine, and I saw a quiet smile on his lips, one that reached his eyes, making them shine with something new. We stood there for a few seconds, just looking at each other, letting the silence speak for us. Eventually, I reached for the door, ready to head inside, but Ethan squeezed my hand one last time. "Thanks," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "For everything." I nodded, squeezing his hand back. "Anytime." And just like that, I knew no matter what came next, we had crossed something important together. Our story wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And that was enough.